So now we're going to look at what we mean by development, and we'll talk about that in this episode and the one to follow, but it's something we'll think about throughout the class. And in this, traditionally, when one talks about economic development, gross national income, the size of the economy, is a typical way to begin. Of course, that's not very useful because depending upon the size of the economy, you could have a lot of income, so that you don't want to just say that India has a lot of income just because there's a lot of people. So income per capita, amount of income per person, is one way to measure the level of development, and people do it. Of course, we learn in economics that just income alone misses the very important point of diminishing marginal utility of income. And so we might want to think of utility of income as in your intro micro class. But the new economic view of development goes beyond income to try to think about personal well-being in a much more deep way. And the most important example of this, most important proponent of this, is the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen. I'll try to have at least one Nobel laureate in each class. But his capabilities approach, or capabilities to function approach, is probably the most important and most widely appreciated and used and applied approaches in the new economic view of development. And so his idea in a nutshell is that it's not stuff that matters, or the utility of stuff, or the characteristics of the stuff even, so that you go beyond bread to see what properties it has. But rather what really matters for well-being is capabilities to function, he says. So functionings are what you can be and you can do. And that's the foundation, a deeper philosophical, if you want, foundation for well-being. And so in his approach, Sen often describes his functionings, choice among functionings and capabilities, as beings and doings, or not often, but he has characterized it in that way to simplify. And so examples are being able to live long, being well-nourished, being healthy, literate, well-clothed, mobile, physically secure, so we come back to the problem of living in violent environments, being able to take part in the life of the community, so we get at the importance of social inclusion, and being happy, which is, as a state of being, can be valued as a functioning. Now, these are all examples of beings, so just a question for you, can you think of some other examples that you might suggest as being important in this regard? So, to go a little bit more deeply into his idea, he says you can't think of growth as an end in itself. It's a kind of fetishism. So development has to be more concerned with enhancing lives that we live, and as he emphasizes, the freedoms that we enjoy. So it's not the stuff that you have that is what income can buy, or the feelings they provide. That's utility in some sense, satisfaction, but what a person is or can be or does and can do, to amplify. So not just characteristics. So think about functionings then. And so functionings that we can value range from very basic things, being adequately nourished, dealing with some of the constraints that the poorest of the poor face, to relatively or very complex, being able to take part in community life. That's very complex. On the other hand, it's something that all humans need as a basic kind of functioning. You can think of basic needs, physical needs of nutrition and so on, as being one dimension of what we need fundamentally, but being part of community is also a fundamental requirement for not being in a poverty status, if you want. So you can have income, but that doesn't mean that you can explain or adequately predict how well off people are based upon that, because there's disparities, differences between what income is and what advantage is. you would have. So personal heterogeneities is this a pregnant woman, for example? Environmental diversities, do you need heating or cooling? Variations in social climate, do you need to be able to have certain kinds of festivities that you participate in? Intra-household distribution, there are plenty of places in the world where girls are discriminated against in the household. So the amount of stuff per person in the family hardly is enough to get at the idea through income of people's advantages and capabilities to function. So then here he sees measuring well-being by consumption as a confusion, thinking of commodities and having commodities as ends in themselves rather than as means to some end. So for nutrition, the end is health, what you can do with health, and perhaps personal enjoyment, and perhaps social functioning, as in breaking bread together, let's say. And so utility as a measurement doesn't give enough improvement over income in this way. So the value that a person might give to their kind of life, thinking what is worthwhile, is also not necessarily the same as what gives pleasure to the person. So equating utility with pleasure as a goal overlooks the fact that people have other things that they have reason to value. So his emphasis is on having reason to value. So we can consider then functionings that result from choices that people make given their capabilities, that is to say, the freedom they have. So the functioning of a person he considers an achievement. It's what a person succeeds in doing with commodities and with characteristics at his or her command. Bicycling, to distinguish from possessing a bike, and also from the happiness, let's say, generated by bicycling. So that in some sense, goods lead in part to functioning, and from there to utility. So you can think of his approach and his analysis as being somewhere between the goods and services and so on the one side, and the happiness, satisfaction, or other feelings on the other. His focus is, in some sense, on what's central and in between. And he also suggests that subjective well-being is like a psychological state, and that's a functioning. It could be pursued alongside functioning in examples of health and of dignity. So it's not in any way devaluing happiness, it's just saying we need to think of it in a broader context. And so with respect to happiness, there's a couple graphs to show you. This one is in the textbook. It's some very recent data. We have here income between 0 and 80,000 according to this scale, and then a life satisfaction indicator, and that's described in the note. There's lots of ways that you can construct from questions asked in the Gallup World Poll and so on, how happy individuals are, and then this is then used on an average to see how happy, quote unquote, countries are. So each of these dots are not people, but rather they're averages for countries. So we have a lot of countries here, so it's a little bit difficult to plot out all the names, but I have another graph for you. It's earlier data and probably not as good a comprehensive measure, if you want, of happiness. But this is from a prior edition of the text from a 2005 book. And the measure of happiness here is the average of the percent of people who say that they are happy and the percent of the people who say that they are satisfied. There are two ways of looking at this. And here's income per capita. So here is the pattern that we see. And so what I would like to suggest is that if you all might keep this kind of picture in mind and think about what patterns you can discern, what possible interpretations there are for this overall pattern, that maybe would it suffice in themselves to say what's going on, but that would give a viable idea for hypotheses to be explored further, and so that we can discuss that. Thanks.